Greetings to all viewers. Welcome to an introduction to the work with the title The Truth of the Holy Grail, Forgotten History of the Lost Church founded at Glastonbury in 37 AD and Our Hidden Genesis, by Christine Preston. The text that will appear on the back cover is as follows.
Unveiling the fact that the Romans carried out a mass extermination of Britons over a period of 260 years in their effort to enforce Claudius' edict of 42 AD because Christ's doctrine was already spreading from Avalon across their empire. The author reveals that having been appointed leader of 12 disciples, Joseph of Arimathea arrived in the British Isles in 37 AD and founded a church in Glastonbury 500 years before Augustine of Rome began his work of conversion. She identifies the reason that William of Malmesbury gave 63 AD as the date when the disciples arrived. His source, Freykulf, Bishop of Lisieux, had made the erroneous assumption that a donation of land recorded in the Doomsday Book occurred as soon as they had arrived. The Druidic institutions were crushed and the religion established by Christ's disciples was overthrown, which is why Francis Bacon stated, "The Britons were the last of all the churches of Europe that gave up their power to the Roman beast." The author unravels mysteries and exposes an historical suppression of truth in relation to the Holy Grail, a symbolic vestige of the original faith related to the integration of the Word for the transcendence of the human psyche that makes the Christian dogma a false doctrine. She calls into question the claim of uniqueness that is part and parcel of Christ's deification by the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. Salvation is related to the recovery of the perfect nature of the soul that Adam possessed. The angelic or divine nature also is the key that the author uses to unravel the mystery of the sons of God of Genesis 6. Although they are called sons, according to ancient authors, these beings were self-born, like Adam. In the Septuagint they are called angels in the sense of having an angelic nature, and they are now brought to light as initiators who descended among the Atlanteans and intermarried with their daughters. The term Nephilim is now known as a substantive to be read as fallen ones. They were incarnations into the progeny of the sons of God of life forms in connection with the satanic red dragon of the Book of Revelation. This means that the Antichrist that Christians expect to appear in the future belongs to the past.
Please note, only the introduction will be provided in this video, and the footnotes have been removed. Introduction.
We are truly penetrating a realm of lost knowledge with the drama of a slaughter of Britons, by the Romans, as well as their obliteration of Druidic institutions, to enforce an edict declared by Emperor Claudius in 42 AD. All hell broke loose with the Holocaust as the Roman armies enforced this edict. As exposed by George Jowett in the drama of the Lost Disciples, Rome was in fear due to the spread of a doctrine in their empire, from Avalon in Britain to beyond the seas. This doctrine was the one that Christ had asked his apostles to spread to the four corners of the world, and Philip had appointed Joseph of Arimathea as head of 12 disciples to evangelize the British Isles. Joseph's name indicated his origin from the town of Arimathea, a hamlet close to Jerusalem. With regard to Claudius' edict AD 42, the decree was to exterminate the descendants of King David. You might think it is strange that there should be descendants of King David in Britain, but the lost tribes of Israel were not lost. They were just scattered. Some ancient testimonies were in conflict, some stating that Joseph of Arimathea and some disciples traveled on a boat from Judea to Britain in AD 63, and others that they had reached France in AD 35 and Britain in 37. Some researchers were puzzled or thought there were two journeys. This dilemma is now elucidated in the following pages with the discovery of how Freykulfus, or Freckulf, a Carolingian bishop, évêque, of Lisieux, made a mistake circa 825 to 850 AD. He was a historiographer of Christian literature with many works held by member libraries worldwide, And as he wrote a commentary on an epistle by Rabanus Maurus on the Pentateuch, Old Testament, we can assume it was this source that he misquoted. There only was one voyage for the purpose of preaching Christ's doctrine, and Joseph of Arimathea did not arrive in Britain in AD 63 but at the surprising early date of 37, and in less than 5 years the disciples caused enough awakening in the region to alarm the Romans. Led by Joseph of Arimathea, the disciples preached and founded a Church of Christ in Avalon. 26 years later, they were granted land there. The date when they received 12 hides of land is indicated in the Doomsday Book, published in 1088 from existing Saxon records, and the details concerning the ancient authors who testified that Joseph of Arimathea and his disciples arrived in Britain in 37 AD will be given in Chapter 1. There was no second journey in 63 AD, but in a book published in 1135, William of Malmesbury quoted Freykolfus, and the mistake was replicated many times in modern times. We know this because William provides his name when quoting him. Freykolfus appears to have been aware that the Doomsday Book mentions 12 hides of land possessed by the Glastonbury Church which never paid tax and were donated by the local ruler, Arviragus. It also indicates that Saxon kings made further grants later. The questions that had remained unanswered for so long, are now unraveled in Chapter 1 in great details, casting light on how Freykolfus made his mistake. In modern time, William of Malmesbury's critics have been in denial of the history that predates the Saxons. They relegate to the realm of fantasy the testimonies relating to King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, as well as the genealogical tree that indicates Arthur descended from Joseph of Arimathea. Those critics have focused on other details than Freykolfus' error in their attacks to suppress the history related to Joseph of Arimathea and King Arthur, and they don't appear to be aware that at least 9 ancient historians attested to the fact that Joseph of Arimathea's journey took place at the earlier date of 35 AD. That the disciples reached France in that year, and Britain in 37 AD. We will be discovering that the reason for some concealments and suppression of truth throughout history is that the Roman Church's dogma does not correspond to Christ's original doctrine. It is essential that people awaken to the most dramatic historical deception in the world. We will see in Chapter 1 that the disciples were transported from Judea to Europe and that Arimathea arrived in France together with other disciples in 35 AD. The best evidence for the journey made in 35 AD comes from the ecclesiastical annals of the Vatican itself, as we shall discover in details. The point of departure by boat for these disciples was from the city of Caesarea, the home of Saint Philip, and they took the trade route to Marseille. Then following the coast of Brittany they reached Britain and Somerset. The situation in Judea by year 35 AD was not yet due to the Romans but to a war between north and south, as the kingdom of Israel had been split after King Solomon's death. This is when some disciples were fleeing to Phoenicia. It could also be at this time that Jesus Christ made a journey to Majorca, as uncovered by Simha Jakubowicz, an enthusiast and multi-award-winning investigative filmmaker. Christ could have continued to Marseille and then journeyed to Rennes-le-Château, where a persisting legend was the subject of research by Jomègue, a famous author in France. The disciples founded churches in Europe in the sense of establishing a religion, and it was for the objective of putting an end to the spreading of their doctrine from Avalon, in Somerset, to all parts of the Roman Empire, including Europe, that the Roman Emperor Claudius declared an edict of extermination of the descendants of King David in 42 AD. As a wealthy businessman, Joseph of Arimathea may have been the actual owner of some mines in Cornwall, and not merely in the tin trade. We shall have a look at the legend that he brought Jesus on a visit there when he was a child. However, the fact that Joseph of Arimathea actually founded a Church of Christ in Glastonbury, that was crushed, has been concealed, forgotten or lost. The same is true of the mass slaughter of Bretons and complete destruction of the Druidic institutions, that according to George Jowett, occurred during the 1st century and continued with the Diocletian persecutions into the 4th century AD. The Romans were defeated by Boudicca in 61 AD, but that was but temporary, and they managed to inflict the worst damage, as narrated by Jowett, during Diocletian's reign. They finally left in the 5th century AD when their empire was crumbling down. That doctrine or New Covenant, that represented a serious threat to the Romans, started being disseminated from Babylon in about 37 AD. Joseph of Arimathea founded a Church of Christ in Glastonbury 500 years before the official start of the conversion of the British Isles to the Christian dogma of the Roman Church. We will have a look at the theological aspect of this dogma and why it was rejected for a while in the British Isles with the contention that it was not the true faith. For the start of the Church of Rome's outreach in Britain, unlike in Europe, there is a sure date because the arrival of Augustine of Rome, later called of Canterbury, was recorded. We have all the historical details and know he disembarked in 597 AD. As you may already have found out from the back cover of this book, after some time, the churches, in the sense of religion, not merely places of congregation or buildings, established in Britain and Europe, were overthrown. This statement is not to be taken lightly, as it was from Francis Bacon. In Government of England, Bacon also wrote that the Britons told Augustine and his missionaries that they would not let him pervert the ancient laws of their church. He alluded to the existence of churches of Christ, in the sense of apostolic institutions, in Europe, in the Roman Empire, more than 500 years before the date recorded as 597 AD for the official arrival of the Augustinian missionaries who were sent by Rome to convert the British nation to its dogma. Bacon stated, "The Britons were the last of all the churches of Europe that gave up their power to the Roman beast." He added that King Henry VIII took that power back again. This was an allusion to Henry having cut the British nation free from the Church of Rome, as is historically well known. However, this was political and for the objective of entering into another marriage for the chance of procreating in heir, as Rome had forbidden a divorce. But from the theological point of view, his Church of England did not make the reforms that were necessary to return to the original doctrine of Christ of the 1st century, or that of the national church founded by King Lucius in 156 AD. Of course, in his own time, what we know today from research was unknown, or had fallen into oblivion. After all, 1,500 years separated them from the great butchery and holocaust that had occurred at the hands of the Romans, and it was as if a conspiracy of silence had created a veil of secrecy over the great overthrow of the churches of Christ, a terrible tragedy. It was not for political reasons that the people of the British Isles resisted conversion to the Roman Church, but because its dogma was not regarded as the true faith. There are records of what the British bishops replied to Augustine, and what they said was really amazing. When the Christianity that will be referred to as the Roman Church dogma was introduced to the British Isles by Augustine of Rome, aka Canterbury, and his missionaries after 597 AD, the nation had already fallen into a state of amnesia in respect of the doctrine that had been preached in Avalon by the ancient British Church because of the massacre that resulted from the Edict of 42 AD, as well as the fact that persecutions had been carried out there and all over the Roman Empire, over a period of about 300 years. This is the story of the Holocaust that decimated the early British culture 277 years before the Council of Nicaea was convened. According to the official narrative, Christian bishops assembled in this Bithynian city, in Turkey, upon the invitation of the Roman Emperor Constantine I, in AD 325, in an effort to reach a consensus that would represent all Christendom and make a clear declaration of faith. Apparently, only 17 bishops attended out of the 220 who were invited. The churches or institutions that existed at the time in Southern Europe, Northern Africa and the Middle East, were the result of the preaching of the disciples who had been appointed by Christ to those nations, and there are reasons for which the Church of Rome suppressed the existence of those actual churches. It does not want you to know that the mother church founded by Christ and his disciples was organized. It wants you to believe that the Council of Nicaea only defined Christ's doctrine with the Nicene Creed. In reality, Christ's doctrine was altered. Only to some extent did the disciples survive persecution. According to Eusebius records, all the bishops in attendance at this council adhered to Gnostic concepts with the exception of an Alexandrian priest called Arius, circa 250 to 336, who is alleged to have denied Christ's divinity. Arianism contested the attempt to proclaim an equality between the second aspect of the Divine Trinity and God the Father, a theological concept cleverly designed to make an idol out of the human Jesus. How Christ's original doctrine differed from that of the dogma is explained in Chapter 2. The Roman dogma introduced to the British Isles in the 6th century was established upon a theological bedrock of sacrifice on a cross for a redemption necessary due to an original sin consisting in the sexual act of Adam and Eve on the basis of Augustine of Hippo's interpretation in relation to the forbidden tree of knowledge of Genesis. I am referring to what the official narrative calls the most important theologian who produced a systematic interpretation of the scriptures in the 4th century. An inquiry reveals he was a reformed Manichaean who converted to the state religion of Constantine but, controversially, praised Hermes Trismegistus in his writings. To be exact, it has been recorded that Augustine converted to Christianity a few years after the Council of Nicaea. But saying that his concept of original sin was part of the Nicene Creed is not a mistake, as it was only finalized at a later council. The time of implantation of the Roman dogma is easier to identify for Britain than Europe, as its conversion occurred because of the arrival of missionaries, which was recorded and dated to 597 AD. Christ's true doctrine was eclipsed because the dogma of redemption and crucifixion for an original sin was introduced as an instrument of control. In this period, monks tended to destroy testimonies that could have led to the discovery of the big lie, but they did this with the conviction that some historians were heretics. We should consider whether the Gospels were purged of anything that could have represented a contradiction to the dogma. In parallel to this, is the academic theory that the Gospels were written by Flavius Josephus with a mock Jesus, and as a Roman-friendly version of events that Vespasian commissioned him to write. He was emperor from 69 to 79 AD. As Jacob Berman has theorized and discussed in some of his podcasts, two different historical characters may have been used to create the Jesus Christ of the New Testament story, and one of those prototypes was historically crucified and was represented as Judas Iscariot as hanging himself in the New Testament. This could mean that the historical prototype, the teacher, Jesus Christ himself, was not crucified. It just so happens that the Knight Templars were accused of heresy for not believing in the crucifixion. The Romans had ideas of pacifism, but mostly were greedy for a domination that plummeted the West into a medieval age of darkness and ignorance. Their strategy was one of control of minds, even by falsifying history to show that they were more powerful than the cults they were eradicating. The writing of a Roman-friendly version of events that we call the Gospels would have been commissioned by Vespasian and continued by Constantine as a subtle instrument of control and alternative to the use of armies. The years that preceded the Council of Nicaea have remained shrouded in mystery, but now we know that this situation can be attributed in the first place to the Holocaust that took place from 42 AD and these strategies. It's possible that the evidence for the actual existence of Christ was erased as a result of the Roman Church's efforts to conceal that of the church founded by Joseph of Arimathea in England, and although we have the testimonies from ancient authors and historians, some are disbelieved or disregarded as legends. Christians all over the world have been deceived and are following Constantine's doctrine, not Christ's. No denomination calling itself Christian should regard itself as cut free from Rome if they still adhere to the redemption by a sacrifice for an original sin notion, and entirely trust the Bible. We shall look at the history of its translation from the Septuagint with some surprising results. During the medieval period, people had to rely on priests to gain knowledge of what the Bible contained. Later, after the invention of the press, or printing, they were burned at the stake for translating it or printing it, and arrested for having other books in their possession. The study of notions external to the Bible, even of medicinal plants, was branded as pagan, occult, black magic or even satanic. Alchemy was also targeted, but it's a term deriving from the Arabs for chemistry. A Muslim force consisting of Arabs and Berbers, loyal to the Umayyad Emir of Damascus, penetrated and conquered the Iberian Peninsula from North Africa in AD 711. When they were finally ousted out of Spain in 1482, they left behind libraries of works that were studied, and as a result the world entered into the Renaissance period and was liberated from the Roman Church's agenda of subjugation. Another thing to consider is whether the Knight Templars were not so duped as the common people and remained true to the original doctrine. A French king accused them of heresy because he owed them money, but it is now known that they did not forsake Christ, but only rejected his crucifixion. What did they uncover in Constantinople and Jerusalem in the 12th century? Did they discover a different history in which Christ was not crucified? Did they learn from the Arabs and Islam some undisputable truths that had been suppressed in the West by the Roman Church? Was the historian Flavius Josephus commissioned by Vespasian to write a Roman-friendly version of events? Were the Arthurian legends created by the Knight Templars as a way to disclose the truth, as claimed by Ralph Ellis? We will be considering Tony Bushby's proposition in the Bible Fraud that the real Jesus Christ was not crucified, and that he was an archdruid by the name of Bran the Blessed, previously known as Cunobeline, as well as a king of Britain. King Arthur and the Holy Grail are subjects that are deeply interconnected with the Church of Christ that Joseph of Arimathea founded. The history of that period is shrouded in mystery because of a perpetual concealment over many centuries. We shall see that King Arthur's historicity started being rejected as legendary because of the nation's conversion to the Roman dogma, and his possible identity will even be revealed in Chapter 1. The reason that scholars think King Arthur was not a historical character may be that they have been looking for evidence in the wrong century. The ancient records speak of him as having been a descendant of Joseph of Arimathea in a fourth generation, therefore, at the most 100 years later. Yet in movies, Arthur is represented as having lived in the days of the Saxon invasion, therefore by AD 449, a date given by the Venerable Bede, a Benedictine monk in Ecclesiastical History of the English in about AD 731. Some records indicate that the first kings of Britain were related to Joseph of Arimathea and that King Arthur also descended from him because the disciples married into the British royal family. We will be looking at testimonies such as from Polydore Virgil, William of Malmesbury, Maelgwyn of Avalon, as well as John of Glastonbury, who is a historian and genealogist, also Bede, Gildas Botanicus, and Tertullian, a prolific early Christian author from Carthage in the Roman province of Africa, who contributed details that could permit the identification of King Arthur. A lot has been concealed while substantiation for the historicity of this king have been dismissed as legendary or unreliable. With knowledge being snuffed out, Avalon came to be assumed in the 20th century to be a mythical place where the soul of Arthur would go after death. But Avalon was a Saxon term meaning apple. There are many apple trees in Somerset. A forbidden fruit is mentioned in Genesis 3, but it is not named because it's allegorical. However, in folklore or culture it's been associated with an apple. It's possible that the association has its origin in Avalon. There always were two sides, the sons of light and those of the dark, which is how the Dead Sea Scrolls presented them. For thousands of years this world has been the stage of a battle between good and evil, and good was also represented in the Dead Sea Scrolls by the term righteousness associated with Melchizedek and Archangel Michael. The people were denied access to knowledge because, with it, they would have been able to distinguish between the truth and the lie. We shall find out there was no original sin in our primordial history, but something far more nefarious happened with the incarnation of the Nephilim, who are mentioned as the progeny of the sons of God in Genesis 6, 1-4. The expression sons of God corresponds to the Hebrew Beni Ha-Elohim in the Masoretic text that some scholars erroneously refer to as the Hebrew original. The Masoretic text is a bit mysterious, as we shall see in the exegesis. The term is from Jewish rabbis called the Masoretes or Masoretes, who are sometimes referred to as having copied the Hebrew text of the Old Testament. However, the definition for the Masoretic text is the authoritative Hebrew and Aramaic manuscript of the Hebrew Bible, in 24 books, in Rabbinic Judaism. The term Ha-Elohim in Genesis 6, translated as sons of God, was believed by 19th-century scholars to always mean divine or angelic. However, this term should be understood as beings with an angelic nature in the sense of the initiators that some ancient authors called self-born or self-begotten. The groundbreaking revelation, provided in the exegesis, is about who the sons of God were. It is in conformity with the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, the name by which the Egyptian Thoth was known in Alexander the Great's empire. These teachings were in the Library of Alexandria during the reign of Ptolemy II, when the translation known as the Septuagint was carried out. Furthermore, the exegesis insists that the sons of God were not evil, as some exegetes of the fallen angel theory have declared. They were unaware that the term Nephilim is only a reference to their progeny. The teachings kept at Alexandria were Egyptian and very ancient. Iamblichus, who died circa 330 BC, wrote that Plato and Pythagoras visited Egypt and read the tablets of Thoth/Hermes with the assistance of some priests. As we shall see in the exegesis, other ancient authors mention some writings on walls of structures and pyramids. The teachings of Hermes tell us that Adam's perfect nature can be recovered by acquiring wisdom, virtue, as well as detachment from worldly things, and by reflecting the image of God within and in the world. The principle of the recovery of the lost nature is the same as that encapsulated in the imagery of the Holy Grail, the integration of the Word, or Christos, in the human heart and mind, which the Roman Church claimed to be unique to the incarnated Christ. It is known that these Hermetic treatises were in circulation in the classical Greek and Roman empires in the 2nd century BC. Arabic texts were translated from Syrian sources in the 9th century. The body of Hermetic writings in Arabic is distinct from the Hermetica of the Roman Empire that the Byzantine Church purged of occult teachings, and what contributed to their preservation is the fact that a Pythagorean philosopher, by the name of Apollonius of Diana, who was also known as Belinus and lived in the 1st century CE, rediscovered the secrets of those Hermetic treatises, studied them and taught them, as in his time they already had been lost for generations. In the centuries that followed, Hermes' teachings were preserved by the Arabs. Thanks to some records kept by Islam and its scholars, we have the information that Enoch, also known as Idris, was Hermes, and the latter is the name by which the Greeks called the Egyptian Thoth. However, 1 Enoch is generic and has been interpolated. Islam recorded that Belinus derived his knowledge from the Hermetic tablets. These are also known as the Emerald Tablets. André Jean Festugier wrote in the 1950s that Trismegistus means 3 times great because Hermes recognized himself, or remembered who he had been, in 3 incarnations. Hermes recovered knowledge during his last incarnation by telepathic communication with Pymander, who was his own monadic presence, higher mind, or higher self. He addressed him as father, and in turn Pymander called him my son, a terminology also used by Christ. He wrote it down in 17 books that were preserved in the Arabic tradition. He was called the scribe of God and messenger in that sense. The terminology of father and son is present in the New Testament, and we should understand that Jesus was also channeling the universal Christ, the mediator between God the Father and man, whom Jesus Christ channeled, would have stated through him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father, except through me, John 14:6. But obviously, the Council of Nicaea did not recognize this phenomenon. The source could also have been an archangel as they are solar or a manifestation of the Logos, and function as emissaries of God. It also was by this method that Moses obtained the 10 Commandments, and that all communications with the archangels took place, as recorded in scriptures, and this method of communication continues in present time, but the phenomenon related to telepathy and dictations obtained from the beings of higher dimensions is being concealed. In Hermes' teachings is the idea that Seth, not Adam, represents mortal man, and that the perfect nature that Adam possessed was lost by his progeny, but that it can be recovered. The perfect nature is the key to unravel the mystery of the sons of God. Adam epitomizes the sons of God, and in my opinion, they were initiators with an angelic nature and a righteousness like that of Christ. In fact, Christ was called a second Adam in Neoplatonism. This notion was preserved in Judaism and the concept of the return of a Messiah, or many. The Church of Rome has opposed the fallen angel theory since Julius Africanus introduced his interpretation that the sons of God were the sons of Seth and intermarried with the daughters of Cain in about 200 AD. The exegesis presented here in Chapter 8, in which the sons of God are epitomized by Adam, will therefore be groundbreaking. With regard to the term Nephilim, there has been a breakthrough in academic circles as some scholars have discovered that it is a substantive for the verb to fall and should be translated as the fallen ones. We shall see that it does not relate to the sons of God, but solely to the progeny that created corruption in the old world. The red dragon is interpreted by Catholics as Satan, whom they believe will return as Antichrist, but they have omitted to mention the fact that this Satan took on the face of a man, in fact of many, and of those referred to in Genesis 6 as the Nephilim. The Book of Enoch, also known as 1 Enoch, includes ideologies that seem to be derived from Hermes' teachings. However, the book ascribes the corruption of the antediluvian world to a revelation of secrets on the part of the Watchers to the women they cohabited with, which is in conflict with the Hermetic records of a divine revelation of knowledge intended to be for the creation of civilization. In its interpretation that the Watchers abandoned their celestial duties to have sexual intercourse with human women, the Book of Enoch names the leader of the Watchers as Semyazah and another member of the group, as Azazel, who spread sin and corruption among humankind. They are condemned to a judgment at the end of time. Genesis tells us that Enoch was the 7th from Adam. He lived in the antediluvian era and was Noah's grandfather. The origin of the Book of Enoch is Coptic, therefore Egyptian. It is said that the text of 1 Enoch was composed in the 1st to 3rd centuries CE. It was recovered from the Church of Abyssinia, or Ethiopia, and copies were excavated at Qumran, so the deterioration of the message, observed here, could date from the 1st century CE, or any time after the Library of Alexandria was burned, about 200 years after the translation of now-lost Proto-Masoretic texts came to being as the Septuagint. While discussing Augustine of Hippo and his concept of original sin, we will consider the meaning of the forbidden tree of knowledge and the idea that mankind did not commit an original sin, but that the Nephilim, the lost sheep, or wolves in sheep clothing, misused power. They were incarnations of the satanic red dragon of the Book of Revelation. Ignatius Donnelly regarded the Atlantean cataclysms, due to which Poseidon was submerged, as the model for the flood of Genesis. Poseidon was the last island of Atlantis, 12,000 years ago, so the narrative will drift to the hidden history of the downfall of civilization as a result of the incarnation of the Nephilim. The Sons of Light in the Dead Sea Scrolls have been under attack. Mankind has been indoctrinated with erroneous concepts by this satanic power for an agenda of control. And when looking for answers, we should remember that some testimonies communicated in the New Testament are from disciples who were indoctrinated by the fallen angel theory as it developed before Christ's time. It has been revived due to a growing interest in the Book of Enoch. In my opinion, what can cast light on the subject is the fact that the term Nephilim in Genesis 6:1-4 only refers to the progeny of the intermarriages between the sons of God and daughters of man, not the sons of God themselves. We will find verification in the theosophical concept of root races to identify the sons of God as initiators of the third root race who intermarried with the Atlantean daughters of the fourth root race, their progeny being of the fifth root race. A comparative study of the Vedic legend related to Manu makes us realize that the incarnation of evil was by exception, and like Manu, Noah was righteous. Adam also is an archetype and personification for divine dynasties that were followed by semi-divine ones and degenerated into mortal ones. This relates to the fall from paradise of Genesis 3 as well. The ultimate teaching of the Messiah would be a revelation of how to recover this paradise. This path is known in Eastern religions and spiritual teachings. It is the path of initiations and ascension. This ascension is possible for the soul after death, but it also is achievable during one's lifetime. The real Master Jesus may have been the first to have demonstrated resurrection, but without crucifixion. This path consists in recovering the perfect nature, the righteousness, that Adam possessed. It is possible by an integration of the light and nature of God that is made available to mankind through the Word, or Logos, the second aspect of the Divine Trinity, or Son of God. However, it is man's duty to raise the whole earth into perfect conditions too. Christians believe in the coming of Antichrist in the future, and this is the product of misinterpretations in the medieval period. The term means a power that is adversarial to Christ. As we look into the identification of the sons of God of Genesis 6 and the exegesis, we will find out how Antichrist has returned and is among us as the reincarnation of the so-called Nephilim. The final message is that no angel of the angelic realm fell by lust. The fallen ones were corporeal and the fall was human. A force of darkness has been at work to keep mankind uninformed, and one of its moves was the burning of the Library of Alexandria by Julius Caesar, 200 years after the Septuagint was translated. This is how the key to the interpretation of the Scriptures was lost. The New Testament records the coming of Christ to oppose a satanic force and even dethrone it. And chapter 12 of the Book of Revelation informs us that it was cast on earth. The subject of the original Church of Christ, and its connection to the Holy Grail, is linked to the identification of who the sons of God were in a way that Archangel Michael summarized in a dictation recorded word for word, as follows. The Word, a term that appears as logos in Greek, is the clue to the Holy Grail. Christ was not unique as the word's incarnation, as it is an alchemical power that can transform the human psyche and that can be integrated for a recovery of the perfect nature that, according to the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, Adam possessed. However, in this light, the method of redemption by a sacrifice becomes unnecessary. The key to unravel the mystery of the sons of God of Genesis 6 is the contention that the term Beni Ha-Elohim, in the Masoretic text, should be read as sons with an angelic nature. On the basis of ancient authors, they were self-born, meaning without parents like Adam. They are revealed as initiators who descended among the Atlanteans and intermarried with their daughters. However, in their progeny incarnated enough fallen ones to create the downfall of the antediluvian world. They will not return as Antichrist, as Christians believe due to a medieval misinterpretation of the Book of Revelation. In the Dead Sea Scrolls they are referred to as the sons of darkness. They were believed to be incarnated in the Romans. They crushed the first-century Church of Christ.